On the morning of September 12th, 1683, as the first pale light spilled across the slopes of the Kahlenberg, a moment was beginning that would decide the fate of an entire civilization. Below the mountain, Vienna was dying. For 2 months, its people had endured starvation, disease, the endless crash of Ottoman cannon, and the creeping certainty that no help would come. Mothers fed their children paste scraped from bookbindings. Soldiers boiled leather into broth. The last horses had been slaughtered long ago. The defenders were skeletons wrapped in rags, their eyes sunken but burning with a refusal to surrender. And above them, like a silent storm gathering its fury, 3,000 winged hussars waited for the signal that would hurl them into legend. But long before the thunder of hooves shook the earth that morning, the story of Vienna's salvation truly began months earlier, when the mightiest empire on the planet prepared to erase Europe's ancient heart. In July of 1683, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, its armies unmatched, its wealth unrivaled, its ambition unbroken since the days when its sultans had first dreamed of taking the golden apple. Vienna, the gateway to the West. To Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of immense pride and burning ambition, this was more than military conquest. It was destiny. He marched toward Vienna with 170,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had seen since the Mongols, a force so vast that dust clouds risen by its movement could be seen for miles. He believed the city would fall in days, perhaps weeks. He believed he would surpass the glory of Suleiman the Magnificent. And he believed no Christian army could possibly save the doomed city in time. Inside Vienna, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg understood exactly what was coming. He commanded barely 15,000 soldiers, many of them untrained civilians, and he knew his medieval walls were no match for Ottoman cannons. Yet he also knew that surrendering meant slaughter, enslavement, or forced conversion for all who lived behind those walls. And so he decided that Vienna would fight to the last man, woman, and child before raising a white flag. When the Ottomans arrived on July 14th, they surrounded the city like a tightening noose. Their siege lines stretched for miles, complete with trenches, towers, and hundreds of massive cannons that hurled stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds into Vienna's crumbling defenses. Their camp was a city unto itself, filled with markets, musicians, fountains, even private zoos. Kara Mustafa had created not merely a military encampment, but a palace of silk, gold, and indulgence sprawled across the plains. Victory, he believed, was inevitable, so why not enjoy it in comfort? His overconfidence would become one of the many threads that doomed him. The siege soon descended into a nightmare of smoke, dust, and blood. Ottoman engineers tunneled under the walls, planting mines to collapse entire sections of the city's defenses. Viennese soldiers dug countermines, and in the choking darkness beneath the earth, men fought with knives, picks, and their bare hands. Above ground, cannon fire turned entire districts into rubble. Churches collapsed. Homes vanished. Every sunrise brought fewer defenders. Every sunset carried the echo of the drums from the Ottoman camp, a reminder that death was patient but certain. Yet outside Vienna, a miracle was forming, one that Kara Mustafa arrogantly dismissed. When the city's desperate pleas for help reached King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, he faced a decision that would shape history. His advisors warned him not to intervene. His nobles resisted. The Austrians had been Poland's rivals for generations. The road to Vienna ran through difficult mountain passes, nearly impossible for heavy cavalry. And even if he arrived, he would be facing an army more than twice the size of his own. But Sobieski did not hesitate. He wrote back, "I will come. Hold on as long as you can." So he gathered his army and began a march that seemed mad. Through mud, storms, and narrow mountain passages, the Polish forces pushed forward. Behind them, German princes who had once warred with Austria now united against a common threat, sending soldiers even though many of them had little love for Catholic Vienna. This strange, fragile alliance crept ever closer to the Danube, a patchwork of nations and faiths united by the knowledge that if Vienna fell, nothing would stop the Ottomans from marching into the heart of Europe. By late August, Vienna was in its death spiral. Food was nearly gone. Powder stores were dwindling. On September 4th, a major bastion collapsed under a massive Ottoman mine, and Janissaries surged through the breach. The defenders barely managed to push them back. Kara Mustafa announced that the final assault would take place within days. He believed nothing could save Vienna now. But he did not know that in the forests north of the city, 70,000 Christian soldiers, Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, Swabians, were gathering under the command of Sobieski. They climbed the Kahlenberg in the pre-dawn hours of September 12th, a massive army emerging like ghosts from the trees while Vienna burned beneath them. That morning, priests carried crosses between regiments. Soldiers knelt for Mass, Catholics beside Protestants. Men who mere decades earlier had butchered one another in the 30 Years' War, now praying side by side, their whispered words rising toward a sky stained with smoke. The battle for Vienna was about to begin, and it would unfold with a ferocity no one could have imagined. The Ottoman camp below them glittered in the morning light, unaware that death was gathering on the mountain. Kara Mustafa still refused to believe that a major army had arrived. He ordered only small detachments to face the threat, while his elite troops remained focused on breaching the city walls. His fatal mistake was simple. He believed Vienna would fall before anyone could reach it. He believed the Christian coalition would never dare fight him on open ground. And most of all, he believed the Winged Hussars, those legendary Polish knights feared across Europe, were too far away to matter. He was wrong on all counts. As the sun climbed higher, the coalition army began advancing through the woods, facing fierce Ottoman resistance. Muskets thundered. Cannon smoke drifted through the trees. The ground shook with the clash of steel and the screams of horses. For hours, the fighting seesawed violently. On the slopes, German infantry pushed forward step by bloody step. In the valley, Ottoman cavalry rushed to form new lines, confusion spreading as units received contradictory orders. The massive Ottoman war machine, which had crushed fortress after fortress across continents, found itself unable to adapt to the sudden assault behind its siege lines. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg saw the Turkish formations shifting away from the walls. His heart stirred. He ordered a desperate sortie, sending every man who could still hold a musket charging into the trenches they had stared at for 2 months. Half-starved soldiers leapt upon Ottoman troops who had expected to be inside the city by sunset. The psychological shock was enormous. Suddenly, the Ottomans were being attacked from the city they expected to conquer, and from the mountain they had dismissed as irrelevant. By early afternoon, the battle had reached a terrible equilibrium. Thousands lay dead. Neither side had yet gained the advantage. But on the highest ridge, something was forming, something the Ottomans had not accounted for, something that would soon crash upon them with the force of a storm sent from heaven. The Polish cavalry was assembling, 18,000 horsemen with 3,000 winged hussars at their core, angled their lances toward the plains below. The moment was not yet right, but soon it would be. Soon the charge that would shatter an empire would begin. And when it did, history itself would tremble. By early afternoon on September the 12th, 1683, the slopes of the Kahlenberg had become a cauldron of smoke, musket fire, and desperate maneuvering. Yet the moment that would determine the fate of empires was still gathering momentum like a tightening spring. For hours, German and Austrian infantry had hacked their way through Ottoman outposts in the forest, forcing the defenders back step by bleeding step. The air was thick with gunpowder. Visibility sometimes shrank to mere yards as clouds drifted between the trees. Both sides fought with a determination born of exhaustion and necessity. The Ottomans believed they were on the verge of taking Vienna. The coalition believed they were on the verge of losing Europe itself. In the Ottoman camp, however, chaos was beginning to seep through the cracks of discipline. Kara Mustafa, still convinced that the Christians lacked the strength for a major assault, continued to hold many of his elite units near the siege lines, expecting the final push into Vienna at any moment. Reports from subordinates were contradictory. Some shouted that a massive Christian army had descended from the mountain. Others insisted it was only a raid meant to distract them. The Grand Vizier, accustomed to obedience and accustomed to victory, dismissed most warnings with irritated gestures, preferring comfort in his vast silk pavilion rather than the harsher reality developing beyond it. Meanwhile, the Christian advance widened. On the left, Duke Charles of Lorraine guided his troops through tangled brush and narrow ravines, engaging fierce resistance from Ottoman lines, hastily repositioned to meet the threat. He knew his task was not to win the battle outright, but to pull Ottoman troops away from Vienna, to stretch their formations thin, and to buy enough time for Sobieski's decisive blow. In the center, Prince Waldeck's men bore the brunt of the Ottoman janissaries, those legendary infantry whose discipline had carried the crescent standard across continents. Their volleys were mechanical and devastating. Entire Christian companies were shattered in minutes, only for replacements to stumble forward and take their place. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg's sortie had swelled into something larger than he could have hoped for. His starving troops, gaunt and hollow-eyed, fought with a ferocity that astonished the Ottomans, who had spent months assuming the defenders were spent. The city's gates, once symbols of despair, now became the mouths of a lion lunging outward. The effect on the besiegers was profound. Panic rippled through trenches as Ottoman soldiers, expecting an imminent breakthrough into Vienna, instead found themselves fighting enemies who had refused to die quietly. What had been a clean, methodical siege operation was rapidly turning into a battle on two fronts, a nightmare scenario for any commander. Yet the Ottomans still held the advantage in numbers, equipment, and position, until the one thing Kara Mustafa had never believed possible happened. The forest clearing that separated the slope from the open plains was suddenly free of resistance. The coalition infantry had broken through, and now the cavalry, the true fist of the relief army, could deploy. On the highest ridge, King John III Sobieski surveyed the battlefield with the cold precision of a veteran who had lived half his life amid wars. The moment he had waited for was finally coming into focus. Below him stretched the vast Ottoman camp, a glittering sprawl of tents, banners, smoke, and confusion. Columns of troops were streaming back and forth, unsure where the real danger lay. The massive artillery batteries still pointed toward Vienna, useless against the threat approaching from the mountains. And threading through the camp like veins of cloth were narrow paths between tents, paths that, from Sobieski's vantage point, looked eerily like guided channels carved for a cavalry charge. He understood instantly that the luxury of the Ottoman encampment, designed to showcase power, had become its Achilles heel. He rode along his cavalry lines, speaking quietly, sometimes only with a nod, to soldiers who needed no further speeches. These were not beginners. They were the hardened nobility of Poland and Lithuania, men who had faced Tatars, Swedes, Muscovites, and Turks across decades of war. They were the Winged Hussars, the last true knights of Europe, wearing armor that shimmered in the afternoon sun and wings that rose from their backs like the plumage of mythical creatures. Their long lances, 18 feet of ash wood tipped with steel, were held upright like a forest bristling with the promise of death. The wings, feathered frames fixed to their saddles or armor, were more than decoration. In the wind, they made an eerie, shrieking sound, a supernatural howl that terrified horses unaccustomed to it, and unnerved enemies who had never faced these living phantoms of war. The Ottomans, though seasoned, had never encountered such a sight en masse, and they were about to face not dozens, but thousands. Behind the hussars, thousands more mounted troops waited: German cuirassiers, Polish panzerni, light cavalry from Bavaria and Saxony, 18,000 horsemen in total. Sobieski had arranged them in 4 massive wedges, each one designed to pierce and then scatter enemy lines like ships breaking apart on rocks. He positioned the hussars at the very point of the formation, ready to deliver the decisive blow. Timing would be everything. The slopes of the Kahlenberg created the perfect gradient for acceleration, steep enough to build unstoppable momentum, gentle enough not to exhaust the horses before impact. Below, the battlefield heaved with motion. The coalition infantry, exhausted from hours of brutal combat, was beginning to waver under renewed Ottoman pressure. Janissaries counterattacked in disciplined waves. Sipahi cavalry attempted flanking maneuvers. The dust and smoke were so thick that even the sun above dimmed to a dull, metallic glow. The moment of equilibrium, when neither side could advance nor retreat, had arrived. And that was exactly the moment Sobieski chose. He lifted his baton. 18,000 cavalrymen straightened as one. 3,000 hussars lowered their lances. Silence rippled through the ranks, a silence so complete that even the roar of distant combat seemed to fade beneath it. Then Sobieski spurred his horse forward. At first they walked. Then the walk grew into a trot. The trot lengthened into a canter. The canter built into a full, thundering gallop. The earth trembled under 70,000 hooves. Dust exploded behind them in a long, sweeping trail. The sound grew, first a rumble, then a roar, then the deafening cacophony of metal, hooves, and the unearthly shriek of wooden wings slicing the air. The winged hussars accelerated downhill like a force of nature, a living avalanche of steel and fury. On the plains below, the Ottomans saw death descending. Panic spread like fire on dry grass. Entire units forgot their orders. Horses reared. Officers screamed for formation. Drummers beat frantic rhythms that were lost beneath the thunder rolling from the mountain. And still the cavalry came. Closer, faster, unstoppable. The largest cavalry charge in history, the strike that would break the siege, shatter an empire, and change the destiny of Europe, had begun. The thunder of the cavalry charge rolled across the plains like a storm tearing loose from the heavens. As the winged hussars and supporting cavalry swept down the Kahlenberg, the very ground seemed to quake beneath them. Ottoman soldiers, hardened by decades of campaigns across continents, stared upward in disbelief at the sight of 3,000 armored riders with great wings rising from their backs, descending with the full momentum of gravity and fury. For a moment, it did not feel like a battle between men, but a collision between mortal armies and some divine force unleashed from the mountains. The first Ottoman units to face the oncoming wave were Sipahi cavalry, proud warriors famed for their skill and loyalty. But even they were unprepared for what struck them. The Hussars hit their lines at a speed approaching 40 miles per hour. The impact of heavy horses and 18-foot lances punching through ranks as if they were made of paper. Shields splintered, armor shattered. Riders were thrown from saddles as if swept aside by a tidal surge. The Sipahis, who had faced down European knights, Persian horsemen, and Bedouin riders, found themselves overwhelmed in seconds. Those not killed outright turned and fled, desperate to escape the avalanche of steel. Behind them, the Ottoman infantry tried to form ranks. Drummers beat frantic rhythms. Officers shouted commands lost beneath the deafening roar. Janissary officers ordered musketeers to kneel, aim, and fire. The volley was disciplined, perfectly timed, and deadly, but it was not enough. The Hussars came on, lances leveled, sabers drawn, pistols fired at point-blank range as they crashed into the Ottoman lines. A musket ball could kill a man. A hussar charge could break an empire. The camp itself became a trap. The luxurious sprawl that Kara Mustafa had built, its silk tents, merchant stalls, elaborate pavilions, and narrow aisles, now funneled the charging cavalry directly toward the Ottoman command center. Horses tore through rows of tents, collapsing them on fleeing soldiers. Wagons overturned. Campfires scattered embers into the chaos. The elegant avenues of the camp became corridors of death as the Hussars pressed forward, unstoppable. John III Sobieski, riding at the front of the central wedge, felt the shock of impact run up through his saddle, through his armor, through his bones. He did not slow. He had waited his entire career, perhaps his entire life, for this moment. Smoke and dust swirled around him as he urged his destrier deeper into the heart of the Ottoman camp, striking down any who stood before him. A surge of cavalry followed in his wake. German cuirassiers, Polish panzerni, light cavalry, filling the gaps, widening the breach, turning the initial penetration into a widening tear in the Ottoman formation. The Janissaries, the elite infantry who had dominated battlefields for centuries, tried to stand their ground. They fired volleys into the oncoming riders, then drew yataghans and attempted to slash at horses' legs as the cavalry thundered past. Some managed to form squares, others managed to create pockets of resistance, but the momentum was too great. Hussars shattered their formations. Supporting cavalry swept through the openings. Everywhere the Janissaries attempted to rally, the charge found them and crushed them under hoof. The noise was indescribable. Hooves striking earth, metal on metal, men shouting prayers, the haunting shriek of thousands of hussar wings slicing the air. Witnesses would later swear it sounded like an army of angels descending, others like demons unleashed from the pit. But all agreed that nothing in their lives had prepared them for the sight or the sound of the charge that shattered the Ottoman army. In the heart of the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa finally understood the truth that had been clawing at the edges of his mind all morning. The Christians had not simply attacked. They had come with the full force of Europe, and their charge had become an unstoppable instrument of destruction. He watched from his grand pavilion as lines collapsed, as Sipahis fled, as Janissaries fell back in disarray. He watched the Hussars slicing through his army, the long wings rising and falling like the beating feathers of mythical birds. He had seconds to decide whether to stand or flee. He chose to flee. His retinue scrambled to save the most valuable items, but it was too late. The Polish king's wedge broke through the final defenders and surged toward the pavilion. For the first time in his life, the Grand Vizier felt the cold spike of absolute terror. He abandoned his command tent, his war chest, his personal treasures, and even the sacred banner of the Prophet, an object whose loss was considered more catastrophic than the fall of a city. Behind him, the Hussars overran the pavilion. The gold-embroidered silk collapsed beneath the hooves of cavalrymen who had fought for hours to reach this moment. The richest tent ever erected on a European battlefield became a symbol of Ottoman hubris, trampled into the dirt by the very riders Kara Mustafa had sworn would never arrive. In less than 20 minutes, the proud, immense Ottoman host, 170,000 strong, began to disintegrate. What had been a disciplined army became a sea of panicked men fleeing across the plains. The coalition cavalry pursued them relentlessly, driven not just by the thirst for victory, but by the memory of Vienna's suffering. Dust rose in great clouds as Ottoman soldiers ran, discarding shields, muskets, armor, anything that slowed their desperate flight. What had been a siege turned into a rout so total that it defied military explanation. Vienna, the city that had held out against starvation, bombardment, and despair for 60 grueling days, was saved not by chance, nor by superiority of numbers, but by faith, timing, and the unstoppable fury of the greatest cavalry charge ever unleashed. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when the last pockets of Ottoman resistance broke. The siege that had nearly crushed Christendom was over. Europe, in 20 minutes, had been pulled back from the brink of annihilation. Yet the consequences, the human stories, the grief, the triumph, the reckoning, were only just beginning to unfold. As the last echoes of battle faded across the plains, the reality of what had happened began to settle slowly, like dust drifting down after a shattered storm. The massive Ottoman army, which had arrived at Vienna with the confidence of conquerors, was now nothing more than scattered remnants fleeing toward the far horizon. The camp they had built with such opulence, its silk pavilions, glittering ornaments, fragrant bazaars, and endless rows of tents, lay in ruins, trampled beneath the hooves of cavalry and the boots of retreating soldiers. Fires smoldered where lanterns had fallen. Broken wagons lay overturned like carcasses, and everywhere the battlefield was littered with abandoned weapons, shattered shields, and the bodies of those who had believed victory certain. The Christian army, breathless and exhausted, slowed only when darkness began to swallow the day. Even the Hussars, whose charge had seemed supernatural, were spent. Their horses foamed at the mouth, their armor streaked with blood and dirt. Many had broken lances, some had lost feathers from their wings. Yet their eyes still burned with the fierce pride of men who knew they had changed the course of history. Inside the camp, soldiers from across Europe began to take stock of the unimaginable treasures left behind. They found gold coins piled in chests, jeweled swords, embroidered carpets that took dozens of artisans years to weave, silks dyed in colors unseen in the West, spices whose scents filled the air even amid the smoke of battle. They discovered ornate armor, curved blades from Damascus, and ceremonial objects that had traveled across kingdoms. But among all the riches, the most shocking were the provisions. Towering stacks of grain, beans, dried fruits, honey, preserved meats, the kind of food Vienna had not seen in months. For the starving defenders, it was as if heaven itself had opened. When Starhemberg rode out from the city to meet Sobieski, he was barely recognizable. His armor hung loosely on his gaunt frame. His face was hollow, beard matted, eyes sunken from weeks without proper sleep. Yet his posture remained upright, the bearing of a man who had held a city together by sheer force of will. As he approached the Polish king, majestic even in the dust and blood of battle, the two men dismounted and embraced. Witnesses would later recall that soldiers from both armies, hardened veterans who had seen every horror war could offer, wept openly at the sight. "I am sorry we arrived so late," Sobieski said, though his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had marched for weeks and fought all day. "On the contrary," Starhemberg replied, "your timing was perfect." Behind them, Vienna's gates swung open. Thousands poured out, pale, trembling figures, some missing limbs, others supported by loved ones, children wrapped in torn blankets, mothers holding babies so weak they barely had the strength to cry. Many fell to their knees when they saw the cavalry, tears streaming down their dirt-streaked cheeks. They reached out to touch the riders, to thank them in voices hoarse from hunger and smoke. Some kissed the boots of the Polish soldiers, whispering prayers between sobs. One woman, Anna Hoer, who had fed her children a paste made from boiled book bindings, collapsed when she saw carts full of Ottoman provisions. She sobbed uncontrollably as soldiers handed her sacks of grain and dried fruit. Her little boy, barely 8 years old, stared wide-eyed at the food before him and asked in a cracked whisper, "Mama, is this real?" The sound of church bells soon filled the air, bells that had not rung freely in weeks. Their echoes washed over the plains like a hymn of resurrection. People embraced in the streets. Priests led processions of thanksgiving. Some citizens wandered in disbelief, touching the city's battered walls as if to make sure they still stood. But amid the celebration, there was also horror. As Christian soldiers combed through the Ottoman camp, they found wagons full of shackled captives, men and women taken for slavery, children destined to be raised as janissaries, their lives severed from their homes in an instant. Many were too weak to speak. Some cried silently when their chains were broken. Others clung to their rescuers as if afraid they would vanish like a dream. Far from Vienna, Kara Mustafa fled with what little dignity he could salvage. Yet dignity meant little now. His once mighty army lay shattered across the plains. His grand pavilion had been overrun. His sacred banner had been captured. His war chest left behind in the chaos. What remained of his forces, perhaps 10,000 from the original host, stumbled into Belgrade weeks later, a broken procession of survivors. The Ottoman Empire, which had marched toward Vienna with the confidence of destiny, now faced the bitter taste of irreversible defeat. At Belgrade, the Grand Vizier found no sympathy waiting. The Sultan, furious that such a vast army had been destroyed, ordered his execution. And so, on December 25th, 1683, Christmas Day, the man who had dreamed of planting the crescent above Europe was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional death of failed Ottoman officials. The empire he had wished to glorify now viewed him as the architect of its greatest humiliation. Back in Vienna, the spoils of the Ottoman camp were catalogued. Among the treasures were sacks of strange greenish beans, coffee beans, left behind in the panic of retreat. A Polish scout, Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had infiltrated Ottoman lines during the siege, claimed them as his reward. In the weeks that followed, He used those beans to open Vienna's first coffee house, teaching the city to drink coffee with sugar and milk. What had once been the drink of the Ottoman army soon became a cornerstone of European culture, spreading from Vienna into every capital in the West. But beyond treasures and triumph, something deeper lingered in the minds of all who had survived the siege. The knowledge that they had witnessed a turning point, a moment when the world had balanced on a knife's edge. If Vienna had fallen, the road to Rome, Paris, and the heart of Europe would have lain open. The Danube would have become an Ottoman artery, carrying armies deeper into lands unprepared to resist. In 20 minutes, less time than a mass, Europe had been pulled away from the brink, and the wings of the hussars, those great plumes that had risen against the sunrise, had become symbols of salvation. Yet the victory, magnificent as it was, held within it the seeds of future grievances, betrayals, and tragedies. Glory never comes without shadow, and the world that emerged after Vienna would soon learn that salvation, too, has a price. As Vienna celebrated its deliverance, the deeper consequences of the battle began to ripple outward, touching kingdoms and courts far beyond the Danube. The victory was not merely military, it was psychological, ideological, and civilizational. For 3 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the unstoppable force creeping westward, swallowing cities, kingdoms, and empires like a tide of steel and fire. But on September 12, 1683, that tide had reached its high water mark and begun to recede.